Afternoon, everybody, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I think I'm going to be, I hope, a bit challenging and to try to deal with some of the more fundamental issues that I think arise from the use of what we mistakenly call communication technologies. Let me explain. I'll start with trust. Trust matters. We all know it makes life easier. But misplaced trust is a bit of a disaster. If you had had Mr. Madoff as your investment advisor when the banks crashed, you would have lost your money in his Ponzi scheme. So what we actually want is to align trust with trustworthiness and to align mistrust with untrustworthiness. Problem is, it's hard to judge trustworthiness. It's hard, it needs evidence, you have to look for the evidence. And therefore, I think one of the things we must look at if we want to have some view of the ethics in this area is how do we judge evidence? What are the standards of communication that we require, that we need, and what are the standards that are really destructive? Now, the ethics of communication is therefore very much broader than people sometimes imagine, and in my view it's also very much older. If you look it up, you'll find 2 of the 10 commandments are about the ethics of communication. Some people say 3, but I'll go for 2. Plato wrote about the ethics of communication because he explained how his mentor Socrates would not use writing. And you think, well, what's so bad about writing? It's on the whole quite a reliable method of communication. But Socrates thought, and you can see this if you're in a world with writing is new, most people can't read, you find an inscription carved on a stone, who put it there, what does it mean, whose words is it? It's very hard to judge. The written word isn't self-interpreting. The spoken word, as it were, is embedded in our conversation with people we know. The written word was different, and you will find all this, by the way, in the dialogue called Phaedrus. But the most famous example of the ethics of communication being radically disrupted by a new technology was, of course, the invention of printing in the early modern period. And the results were extremely difficult to handle. There was, for example, no distinction between a printer and a publisher. So who was responsible for the stuff that got produced? It took probably about 2 or 3 centuries to work out how we distinguish between the different responsibilities that go into publishing. You have to go to Queen Anne in the early 18th century to find the first legislative definition of copyright. When Charles Dickens toured the US in the 1840s, American printers were busy plagiarizing his works and selling the books. It was a different world. Now, people are inclined to say, but that's so different now. We don't have a problem of scarcity. Everybody can communicate with everybody. That, of course, is completely nonsensical. And I don't just mean that there are those who do not have access to new technologies, but also that communication requires somebody to listen and understand as well as somebody to express themselves. And I think that what has happened in the 20th century was that we tended to focus on a very narrow range of issues to do with communication. In particular, we focused on freedom of expression and rights to privacy. They both matter, but they're not the whole story. There are endless other standards that are equally important for us. And one has to work out how that one's going to find a broader view of the ethics of communication that will be relevant, and let's set the bar lower, at least a bit usable with the new technologies. It's interesting how public opinion has shifted. I think that probably 10 years ago, one might think of it as the age of the cyber romantics. Everybody thought it was all net gain. Things were getting better and better. More and more people could communicate with more and more people. Social media, of course, is a great example. One was going to have a more than Habermasian future of universal engagement and communication. Has that happened? Well, unfortunately, as we all know, once we move away from circles who feel comfortable with this, many people feel some terrible things have happened. They feel, first of all, that there are a lot of things that cause private harms, cyberbullying, other forms of individual crime, enhanced possibilities for financial crime, defamation, unchecked, unchallenged. There's a great deal that worries many people, and they don't know what to do about it. What can we do? Until very recently, I was perhaps naive in that I thought that possibly there was a solution, possibly, by which we persuaded online companies and online agents of all sorts to take on proper responsibilities, for example, the responsibilities of publishers. I've come to think that that is an illusion. We won't have it because, in the first place, there's a jurisdictional problem. That is to say, as we know, the leading internet companies are past masters of offshoring themselves, which they do at present on a huge scale for tax avoidance purposes. But equally, if anybody tried to regulate them, they would do it on a huge scale to avoid the regulation. And if they didn't, somebody else would set up in the non-compliant jurisdictions to provide the same services. So I think we have a real problem there. Maybe there is a solution with some of the private harms, the things like trolling and cyberbullying and extreme forms of pornography. That's because there is at least some convergence of interest between members of the public and the profits of these companies. It isn't too good when, as it happens, your client's advertisement appears next door to a video of a beheading. It tends to put people off. So I think that we have to think that there might be some convergence there, but there may not be convergence sufficient to address the public harms. The public harms are numerous, and of course we are very aware of it, particularly with the news of the last 2 days in Mr. Trump's progress around the world. The public harms are probably principally harms to democracy and to the public space. What we are dealing with is the possibility of anonymous communication on a scale that has never been known before. Now, lots of people behave very well even if they are anonymous, but quite enough people don't. And I do not see that it's easy to get that sorted. There was a time when people thought that if, for example, Facebook had to take on the responsibility of publishers, therefore they would fall under the law of defamation, therefore many problems would be resolved. I'm deeply skeptical about whether that is feasible, not only for the jurisdictional reason that I gave, but also because publishing is, as it were, a craft, a hands-on job. Editorial responsibility takes a lot of time. If you have a technology that permits people to post content, you're dealing with too much content for people to examine it and so on. So there is, I think, a profound difficulty. But what we need, I think, as a start to recognize is these are not technologies that are merely used for communication. I was the other day reading a book by, is he James Williams, who used to work for Google and is now at Oxford, who asserts that these technologies are mainly for influencing, for changing people's attitudes, and that is the ethical space at which we should be looking. Nothing new in some way. We had a book called The Hidden Persuaders more than half a century ago. But I'm not clear that that is an accurate answer. I think that they are communication technologies. They're just not technologies that are only used for communication. And insofar as they are used for communication, they can be used for false misleading, mischievous, damaging, hurtful, harmful communication. It doesn't matter whether this is 1% or even 0.1% of what goes on. It gets, as you all know, recirculated and recirculated at scale, and the damage is then done. So what can we do? I don't think we can really expect to enter a world in which the online service providers, social media companies, data analytic companies say, yeah, we realize what we have to do and we're going to do it. It is too profitable to not do it. And I think that that is the problem that your generation, and you're nearly all a very different generation from me, has to address. It's not going to be addressed by thinking about something called data ethics, because, as I said, data don't do ethics. It has to be addressed by looking at what communication is acceptable, what sort of communication is not acceptable, given that we have multiple constraints, not merely freedom of expression and rights to privacy, but many, many other constraints. Where's a path whereby this plurality of constraints can be respected, and we find that the politicians of the future are protecting and encouraging the technologies rather than trying to get rid of them? As I was walking here from the tube or from the DLR, I was puzzling about where I was in the middle of that housing estate. And somebody said, oh, don't look at that, pointing at my phone and Google Maps. I'll tell you where. And he said, are you going to that technology conference? Well, I said, yes, I am. And he said, sooner it all collapses, the better. So I said, well, you know, we might have to do without electricity if it collapsed. And I didn't dare say what we might think about our bank accounts. But I do think we have to think that out there are people who see this, and not a few of them, as a source of great harm to others. And that's the problem you're all going to have to address. I'll stop there, and maybe we can have a couple of questions here. I know we get moved, or I get moved to another space in a moment.